High in the soaring Andes, where jagged peaks pierce the sky and clouds swirl like ghostly curtains over the mountains, lies a world that seems almost untouched by time. From afar, these landscapes are breathtaking, snow-capped summits gleaming in the sun, valleys cloaked in mist, and cliffs carved by centuries of wind and ice. Yet beneath this serene beauty hides a darkness that few dare to imagine. Here, in the isolation of these sacred heights, the Inca civilization carried out rituals so extreme that they blur the line between devotion and horror. The mountains, which appear as timeless guardians of the earth, were also silent witnesses to human sacrifice. Children, adolescents, and even the most beautiful of the community were carried to these altars, chosen not for wrongdoing, but for their purity, innocence, and the belief that only their blood could satisfy the gods' insatiable demands. To the Inca, these sacrifices were not acts of cruelty, but acts of devotion. Death atop the summits was considered an honor, a gateway to eternal glory, a bridge between the human and divine. Parents, priests, and entire communities accepted these rituals with a combination of reverence and dread, understanding that to refuse the gods was unthinkable. The physical terror of the victims, traversing icy ridges, struggling with thin air, and facing the inevitability of death, was framed within a cultural narrative of cosmic balance. Nature itself demanded the sacrifice. Earthquakes, failed harvests, or storms were interpreted as signs of divine dissatisfaction. In this way, the mountains were both awe-inspiring and terrifying, beautiful and merciless. This story, hidden for centuries in the frozen tombs and ice-crusted altars of the Andes, is one of stark contrasts. The sublime versus the horrific, faith versus fear, love entwined with death. Archaeological discoveries, from perfectly preserved mummies to ritual artifacts, now reveal the chilling realities of what unfolded in these high places. Each frozen body, each carefully arranged offering, tells a story not only of extreme devotion but also of the human capacity to normalize acts that, to outsiders, seem almost unimaginable. By peering into this forbidden world, we are invited to confront the unsettling question: how far can belief and fear of the divine drive human beings? How does the desire to protect one's community, one's land, or one's soul justify the ultimate human cost? In the silence of the mountains, where wind whistles across glaciers and the sun glints off ice like cold fire, the echoes of these sacrifices linger. They speak not only of death but of a culture in which the sacred and the horrific were inseparable, where devotion demanded the ultimate offering, and where the beauty of the natural world masked the most profound human suffering. To look upon these peaks is to feel awe and horror simultaneously, a paradox that has fascinated explorers, historians, and archaeologists for generations. And as we begin to uncover the secrets hidden within these mountaintop shrines, we are reminded that human history is not always a tale of progress and enlightenment, but often a story written in blood, fear, and unflinching devotion. The high-altitude shrines of the Inca were unlike anything in the rest of the world. Perched precariously on ridges where clouds seemed to float beneath the climber's feet, these sacred sites were nearly impossible to reach. From a distance, they appeared almost ethereal, blending into the jagged rock and glimmering ice, as if the mountains themselves had sculpted altars of devotion. But for those who approached, the journey was nothing short of a trial by nature, a test of endurance, courage, and ultimately obedience to the gods. The air thinned rapidly as one ascended, each breath growing heavier, the wind cutting across the body like invisible blades. Every step on the treacherous paths demanded careful attention. One misstep could send a pilgrim tumbling into the abyss. Yet the most feared aspect of the climb was not the mountain itself. It was the knowledge of what awaited at its summit. The Inca believed that the higher the shrine, the closer it brought them to the gods. Mountains were not mere landscapes. They were living deities, guardians of the earth and arbiters of cosmic order. To honor them, offerings had to match their grandeur. And sometimes, the offerings were human. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of carefully constructed platforms on the summits, stone altars, circular terraces, and ceremonial stones, where the chosen victims would face their final moments. These sites were isolated in every sense, beyond the reach of ordinary villages, invisible from the valleys below, and suspended above the ordinary world. The journey itself was part of the ritual, an ascension through the layers of both geography and spirituality, a passage from the mundane into the sacred, and ultimately, the terrifying. Transporting the victims was no small task. Children and adolescents were selected from far-flung villages, often adorned with intricate garments, golden jewelry, and ceremonial paint, marking them as chosen by the gods. The procession up the mountain was both ceremonial and psychologically overwhelming. The victims, aware that they had been singled out for death, were carried or led along narrow paths, their small feet slipping on frost-hardened rocks, their bodies shivering from the freezing altitude. Priests and elders guided them, chanting prayers and invoking blessings, blending comfort with ritualistic authority. To the participants, this journey was a sacred duty. To the victims, it was an ordeal of fear, exhaustion, and inevitability. Archaeological evidence paints a vivid picture of this ascent. Remnants of ropes, paths, and even makeshift shelters suggest that the Inca meticulously planned each expedition. Offerings of food, coca leaves, and miniature figurines accompanied the pilgrims, intended to sustain them and appease the gods. Yet despite these gestures, the mountains were indifferent, their beauty hiding lethal conditions, sudden storms, hidden crevasses, and sheer drops. It is impossible not to marvel at the precision and dedication involved, while simultaneously shuddering at the calculated exposure of children to such extreme danger. The ritual demanded absolute obedience, turning natural peril into a component of sacred ceremony. The psychological tension of the ascent cannot be overstated. Children often knew what awaited them. Some evidence, such as traces of ceremonial drugs and hallucinogens found in hair and tissue samples, suggests that the Inca may have sought to dull fear or induce spiritual transcendence. Others may have entered the journey fully aware, confronting the terrifying reality of death as an inescapable destiny. The combination of isolation, altitude, and ritual pressure created an intense emotional crucible. Villagers who accompanied the procession, families, priests, and officials, experienced a mixture of awe, grief, and duty, their emotions tightly interwoven with faith. The mountains, ever-present and unyielding, amplified every heartbeat, every gasp of wind, and every unsteady step, making the ritual as much about psychological endurance as about spiritual devotion. At the summit, the shrines revealed the duality of the Inca worldview: beauty and cruelty, devotion and terror, nature's majesty and human suffering. Platforms meticulously constructed from stone were lined with offerings, miniature pottery, figurines, textiles, and food, all carefully arranged to honor the gods. The victims, sometimes adorned in bright ceremonial clothing, were placed at the center, isolated and exposed. Every detail, from the direction they faced to the position of their bodies, was part of the sacred script. It was here, on these windswept heights, that the climactic moment of sacrifice would occur, yet even before the final act, the journey itself had already transformed the participants. They were suspended between worlds: life and death, human and divine, terror and transcendence. Contrast frames the surreal nature of these shrines. From afar, the summits were breathtakingly serene, sun reflecting off ice, clouds drifting like silent witnesses, and the peaks rising like frozen cathedrals. From within, however, the scene was charged with human emotion: fear, grief, devotion, and resignation. Archaeologists have described a sense of suspended time at these sites, as if the mountains themselves held their breath. Each frozen mummy, each ceremonial offering, and each stone altar tells a story of calculated planning, religious conviction, and unimaginable psychological pressure. The significance of these mountaintop sacrifices extended far beyond the individual victims. They were offerings meant to protect entire communities, ensure fertile harvests, and maintain the favor of the gods. The extreme elevation of the shrines symbolized a bridge between the earthly and spiritual realms, where the highest peaks became theaters of devotion and terror intertwined. By bringing children and adolescents into this ethereal, yet lethal, environment, the Inca created a ritual that was both morally complex and psychologically overwhelming. The climb, The ritual and the ultimate sacrifice were inseparable elements of a single, terrifying narrative, a story in which the gods' demand for blood dictated the rhythm of human life and death. In the end, the mountain shrines of the Inca remain haunting reminders of devotion taken to its extreme. The ascent was not merely a physical journey but a carefully orchestrated passage into the sacred, a test of faith, obedience, and endurance. Today, the preserved remnants, frozen mummies, ceremonial garments, and stone altars allow us to glimpse the terrifying beauty of this practice. They challenge us to confront the paradox of human culture, a society capable of creating breathtaking art, engineering feats, and complex social systems, yet simultaneously willing to sacrifice its most innocent in the name of divine favor. The story of the Inca mountain shrines is a story of contrast, of awe and horror interwoven, and it is only at the summit, at the very edge of the world, that the full scale of this dark devotion becomes unmistakably clear. The selection of the chosen was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Inca sacrificial rituals, for it revealed the delicate balance between devotion and horror. Children, adolescents, and sometimes young adults were meticulously chosen, not for wrongdoing, but for their perceived perfection, their beauty, innocence, and symbolic purity. This selection process was carried out with solemnity, as if the gods themselves had reached down and fingered their favorite among humanity. Parents often presented their children willingly, understanding that to be chosen was the highest honor imaginable, a guarantee that their family's devotion would echo through eternity. Yet beneath this veneer of pride lay an undercurrent of dread, a silent acknowledgement of the ultimate cost. The children were offered up to the mountains, to the winds, and to the gods who demanded blood, and they would never return. The criteria for selection were as meticulous as they were haunting. Archaeologists and chroniclers describe how priests searched villages for children whose physical attributes were considered exemplary, those with symmetrical features, clear eyes, and unblemished skin. In some cases, siblings were chosen together, emphasizing both familial sacrifice and the symbolic unity of the offering. Girls were often selected for their perceived grace and serenity, while boys were chosen for their composure and stoicism. In certain instances, children from elite families were preferred, their high social status amplifying the significance of the ritual. The chosen were not simply victims, they were embodiments of societal ideals, living symbols of divine favor, and instruments through which the human and the divine converged. Once selected, the children were prepared for the journey in ways both ceremonial and psychologically overwhelming. They were given special clothing, often finely woven textiles dyed in vibrant colors, and adorned with jewelry, feathers, and gold. Their hair was carefully combed and sometimes braided in symbolic patterns. Offerings such as coca leaves, maize, and miniature figurines were placed with them, meant to sustain them on the journey and secure their passage to the gods. Priests performed purification rituals, which could include ceremonial bathing, chanting, and prayers to instill a sense of calm, or perhaps resignation, in the chosen. The meticulous attention to detail contrasted starkly with the terrifying reality of the sacrifice that awaited them, creating a surreal duality between honor and horror. Psychologically, the selection process imposed a complex burden on the families and communities involved. Parents were faced with conflicting emotions, pride in offering their child to the gods and the unbearable knowledge that this act would lead to death. Villagers experienced a collective tension, a mingling of fear and reverence, understanding that the gods' favor was intertwined with human suffering. Chroniclers of the Spanish conquest later described the ceremonial gravity of these events, noting that both children and adults understood, at least instinctively, that the chosen were embarking on a journey from which there was no return. The process of selection, preparation, and procession became an intense psychological crucible, conditioning both participants and observers to perceive horror as sacred. In some cases, the children were given substances, such as coca leaves or maize beer, that may have dulled fear or induced trance-like states. Hair and tissue analysis from frozen mummies indicate that some victims were likely under the influence of hallucinogenic substances, designed to ease the psychological terror of the climb and the ritual itself. These chemical interventions, combined with ritualistic chants and prayers, created an atmosphere where fear, devotion, and altered perception were inextricably linked. To modern eyes, this may seem like manipulation or even cruelty, yet within the Inca worldview, it was an act of care, ensuring that the chosen could meet the gods with composure and grace. The children were often accompanied by priests, guides, and family members on the journey to the mountain shrines, and the social and spiritual weight of this act was immense. The selection process extended beyond the individual. It was a communal event, reinforcing societal hierarchies, cultural values, and spiritual beliefs. In this way, the act of choosing the sacrificial victims was not merely about death. It was a performative affirmation of the Inca worldview, a tangible expression of the balance between human devotion and divine expectation. The ritual reinforced the power of the priesthood, the sanctity of the mountains, and the moral framework that bound the society together. Yet the innocence of the chosen cannot be overstated. Children as young as 6 or 7, sometimes pre-adolescents, were selected with an eerie precision, their youth intensifying the emotional impact of the ritual. Archaeological evidence, such as skeletal development and dental analysis, shows that these were not adults simply presented in ceremonial clothing. They were genuinely children, unaccustomed to the world of labor and survival that shaped the lives of ordinary Inca citizens. Their innocence amplified the paradox of the sacrifice. The most precious, untainted members of society were given over to death in service to faith, and their suffering became the highest expression of devotion. Stories passed down through generations, and later chronicled by Spanish conquistadors, described the stoicism of the children in the face of their fate. Some were said to sing, chant, or pray along the journey, embodying the Inca ideal of courage and spiritual submission. Others, overwhelmed by fear, clung to relatives or wept silently, their small cries swallowed by the wind and the vastness of the mountains. These moments of raw humanity, captured in frozen remains and ceremonial artifacts, reveal a depth of psychological tension that transcends time. The selection of the chosen was not simply an act of ritual. It was a confrontation with mortality, faith, and the paradoxical mixture of honor and terror. The moral complexity of this practice is staggering. From an outsider's perspective, it is unthinkable that children would be offered to die atop mountains, yet within the cultural framework of the Inca, it was an act of ultimate reverence. To refuse the gods was unthinkable, and to accept death as an offering was the highest form of devotion. By carefully selecting the most perfect among them, the Inca created a ritual that was both aesthetically precise and morally provocative, a terrifying ballet in which human life was simultaneously exalted and extinguished. The selection process also served as a psychological rehearsal for the ritual itself. By isolating the chosen, adorning them ceremonially, and surrounding them with both familial pride and communal expectation, the Inca effectively prepared them for the climactic ascent and ultimate sacrifice. It was a journey of the mind and soul as much as the body, conditioning participants to perceive death as transcendence rather than merely an end. This intricate interplay of psychology, culture, and religion highlights the extraordinary complexity of the Inca sacrificial system, revealing a civilization that wove horror, beauty, and devotion into a single, unforgettable ritual. In the end, the selection of the chosen was the first step in a journey that would test every aspect of human endurance, belief, and emotion. It was a ritual that combined awe-inspiring devotion with the most profound psychological terror, transforming children into instruments of cosmic balance, symbols of divine favor, and witnesses to the terrifying majesty of the mountains themselves. By understanding this process, we begin to glimpse the full scope of the Inca worldview, a world in which innocence and sacrifice, devotion and horror, were inseparably entwined, and where the most beautiful among them were destined to die for the glory of the gods. The ascent to the mountaintop shrines was a journey that fused physical endurance with psychological torment, a pilgrimage where every step brought the chosen closer to both the gods and their inevitable death. The mountains of the Andes, vast and unforgiving, rose like jagged cathedrals of ice and stone, their peaks hidden among drifting clouds and endless sky. For the children and adolescents selected for sacrifice, the climb was as much a trial of the spirit as of the body. The thin, frigid air made each breath a labor, the wind sliced across their faces like invisible blades, and the treacherous slopes threatened to cast them into the abyss with every misstep. The very landscape seemed designed to challenge their fragile bodies and fragile minds, a natural crucible through which the sacred ritual would be realized. The journey often began in the villages nestled in the valleys, where families and priests gathered to send the chosen off with blessings, tears, and silent prayers. Parents watched, heartbroken yet proud, as their children were lifted onto the shoulders of bearers or guided along narrow, winding trails. The procession was a mixture of ceremony and necessity, with priests chanting prayers that echoed against the rock walls, coca leaves pressed into the children's hands, and miniature figurines and offerings carefully secured to their clothing. Every gesture, every step, was imbued with ritual significance. Yet beneath this apparent reverence lurked the raw terror of what lay ahead. The children, aware in some measure of their fate, were forced to confront the duality of awe and fear, the grandeur of the mountains and the imminence of death. The climb itself was grueling. Paths twisted along cliffs that dropped hundreds of feet into shadowy valleys, the terrain riddled with loose stones and hidden crevasses. The thin air left climbers gasping, hearts pounding against ribcages, muscles trembling with exhaustion. Yet despite the physical strain, the ritual required discipline and composure. The Inca believed that any sign of weakness could disrupt the balance between humans and gods, that fear or panic might anger the deities and bring disaster upon entire communities. Therefore, children were trained, or conditioned, to maintain stillness and serenity, to transform terror into a solemn acknowledgement of their sacred role. In this way, the ascent became a test of obedience as much as of endurance, with nature itself acting as both the gatekeeper and the accomplice to the ritual. Evidence from archaeological studies of sites such as Yuyayaka and Salcantay provides haunting insight into this journey. Frozen mummies discovered at these summits show signs of exhaustion, malnutrition, and the physical toll of high-altitude travel. Some children were found with carefully arranged clothing, ritual adornments, and traces of ceremonial drugs in their hair and tissues, suggesting a combination of preparation, spiritual guidance, and chemical intervention. These substances may have eased the psychological terror of the ascent, blurring the line between fear and transcendence, yet they also highlight the calculated nature of the Inca rituals. No detail was left to chance, not even the fragile human mind. The psychological intensity of the ascent cannot be overstated. For the children, each step carried the weight of inevitability. The thin, cold air seemed to whisper of the mountain's indifference. The jagged rocks and sheer cliffs reflected the impossibility of retreat. Every gust of wind, every slip on ice, reinforced the realization that life and death were intertwined in this sacred path. For the priests and guardians accompanying the procession, the journey was a combination of awe and terror, a responsibility to ensure the chosen reached the summit intact while maintaining the ceremonial purity demanded by their gods. The mountains themselves became a character in the story, a silent, omnipotent presence that oversaw every movement, every heartbeat, every prayer. The surreal juxtaposition of beauty and horror became apparent as the procession climbed higher. From below, the peaks seemed serene, cloaked in snow and clouds, illuminated by the sun's golden light. Yet within the journey itself, each step carried psychological and physical anguish. The children were exposed, both literally and figuratively, to forces far beyond their control. The wind stripped away warmth, the altitude robbed strength, and the proximity of death hovered as an omnipresent shadow. This stark contrast between the sublime vistas and the intimate terror of the climbers amplified the ritual's psychological power, transforming the ascent into a narrative of human fragility against the vast, indifferent grandeur of the natural world. Throughout the climb, ceremonial elements punctuated the struggle. Offerings were placed at small shrines along the route, prayers were intoned to strengthen courage, and coca leaves were chewed to combat exhaustion and fear. The children's clothing, adorned with gold, feathers, and vibrant dyes, was not merely decorative. It symbolized their status as chosen intermediaries between the human and divine. Every movement, every gesture, was part of a carefully orchestrated choreography designed to prepare them for the ultimate encounter with the gods. The ascent was a prelude, a narrative in motion, where human endurance, natural peril, and spiritual obligation converged into a single, terrifying experience. The ascent also reinforced communal cohesion and societal hierarchy. Villagers who accompanied the procession bore witness to both the horror and the sanctity of the ritual. The selection, the preparation, and the climb were all performative acts, reinforcing the power of the priesthood, the authority of the state, and the moral framework that bound the society together. By participating in or observing the ascent, the community collectively validated the act of sacrifice, ensuring that the ritual's psychological impact extended beyond the individual victims to the entire population. As the procession neared the summit, the combination of physical exhaustion and psychological tension reached its zenith. The children, once playful and carefree, were now transformed into solemn figures of devotion, their bodies weakened by the climb but their minds increasingly attuned to the ritual's spiritual significance. The mountains, silent witnesses to this transformation, amplified every sensation: the crunch of boots on ice, the whisper of wind across frozen cliffs, the muted prayers of the priests. Each step forward brought the participants closer to the edge of the world, closer to the culmination of a journey that intertwined human vulnerability, natural majesty, and sacred terror. Finally, at the summit, the climbers reached the altars, perched precariously on terraces carved into the rock. Here, the culmination of the ascent merged seamlessly with the ritual of sacrifice. The journey itself, with all its physical and psychological trials, had prepared the chosen for the ultimate act of devotion. The mountains had tested their bodies, their spirits, and their minds, and only by reaching the summit could they fulfill their role as sacred offerings. The ascent was both a literal and symbolic passage, a bridge between the ordinary world and the realm of the divine, where human endurance, cosmic faith, and ultimate terror converged in a single, unforgettable moment. In the end, the climb to the mountaintop shrines reveals the extraordinary lengths to which the Inca went to sanctify human sacrifice. It was a journey that combined awe-inspiring natural beauty with unimaginable physical and psychological strain, transforming the participants into instruments of faith, conduits for the gods, and witnesses to the sublime horror of devotion. Through this ascent, the Inca created a ritual that was as much about the journey as the destination, embedding within every step the paradoxical intertwining of human fragility, cosmic ambition, and sacred terror. At the summit, where the air is thin and clouds drift like ethereal curtains around jagged peaks, the ritual reached its terrifying climax. The mountaintop shrines of the Inca were not merely altars, they were stages for the ultimate act of devotion, where human life and divine expectation collided in stark, frozen silence. Here, the chosen children and adolescents, adorned in ceremonial clothing, jewelry, and feathered headdresses, were placed with meticulous care. Every detail mattered: the position of their bodies, the direction they faced, the symbolic items arranged around them. To the Inca, this precision was not ritualistic excess, it was essential. The gods demanded perfection, and even the smallest deviation could imperil entire communities. The shrines themselves were architectural marvels, carved and arranged atop impossible ridges. Circular terraces, stone platforms, and ceremonial stones created a sacred space that elevated both physically and spiritually. Offerings, miniature figurines, maize, coca leaves, and textiles were placed with ritualistic care, designed to accompany the victims into the afterlife. From a distance, these altars appeared almost serene, blending seamlessly into the snowy peaks, but up close, they were charged with tension, anticipation, and a kind of frozen dread. The mountains, silent and indifferent, bore witness to the sacred terror unfolding upon their summits. The moment of sacrifice was approached with deliberate solemnity. Priests and elders performed final rituals, invoking deities and reciting prayers to ensure the offering was accepted. They would chant in low, rhythmic tones, their voices weaving through the wind, a haunting accompaniment to the final journey of the chosen. Children may have been administered coca leaves or chicha beer, substances believed to calm their minds, induce trance-like states, and ease the transition from life to death. Archaeological studies suggest that these substances, combined with the ritual's psychological intensity, created a liminal space where terror and transcendence intertwined. The methods of sacrifice, while varied, were executed with ritual precision. In some instances, children were suffocated, their breath drawn away in carefully controlled ceremonies. Others were left exposed to the icy winds and freezing temperatures of the high Andes, a slow, merciless form of hypothermia that merged physical agony with spiritual purification. Evidence also indicates that blunt trauma was sometimes employed, usually through ceremonial blows that symbolically or practically ended life with minimal suffering. Importantly, these acts were never considered cruel in the Inca worldview. They were the highest form of devotion, a necessary act to maintain cosmic balance. Death at the summit was not an end. It was an ascension, a transformation into divine guardians of the earth and sky. The psychological dimensions of this ritual cannot be overstated. For the victims, the final moments were the culmination of an extraordinary journey, from selection to preparation to ascent. The mountains had tested their bodies, the priests their minds, and the ritual itself their spirits. Archaeological evidence, including remarkably preserved mummies, clothing, and ceremonial artifacts, reveals traces of the victims' physical and emotional states. Some children show signs of being sedated or in trance, while others display postures suggesting resignation or even awareness. These frozen moments offer a haunting window into the experience of human beings confronted with the sublime terror of death framed as sacred duty. The visual imagery of the sacrifice was as important as the act itself. Priests carefully arranged each victim, often in seated or reclined positions, ensuring that every aspect of the ritual aligned with cosmological symbolism. Gold and silver ornaments were placed nearby, coca leaves in their hands, and miniature figurines of animals and deities scattered around them. In some cases, the victims' faces were painted or adorned, creating a visual narrative of purity, devotion, and transcendence. From the perspective of the gods, this presentation was perfect. From a human perspective, it was a scene of unimaginable tension, beauty, and terror intertwined. The freezing high-altitude environment amplified every sensation. The cold air stung exposed skin, snow and ice created a sensory assault, and the sheer isolation of the summit reinforced the finality of the act. It is difficult for modern observers to grasp the combination of awe and horror that defined this moment. The mountains, majestic and indifferent, framed the ritual with breathtaking vistas, while the chosen children, instruments of cosmic devotion, faced mortality with a mix of fear, acceptance, and transcendent purpose. In this stark contrast, the ritual's emotional power was fully realized, the sublimity of nature intertwined with the horror of human sacrifice. Anthropologists and forensic scientists studying these mountaintop mummies have uncovered traces of careful preparation that speak volumes about the Incas' meticulous approach. Clothing, textiles, and hair braiding were preserved in extraordinary detail, revealing that aesthetic considerations were intertwined with ritual significance. The position of the bodies, the arrangement of offerings, and even traces of ceremonial paint suggest a choreography designed to please the gods and honor the victim's passage. Every detail was intentional, reflecting a worldview in which beauty, order, and terror were inseparably linked, and where the sacred demanded human life as its medium. The communal aspect of the sacrifice also played a critical role. While the victims were physically isolated at the summit, the ritual was inherently social. Families, priests, and community members participated in the process, both directly and symbolically. The selection, preparation, and ascent were observed by communities, and the culmination at the shrine reinforced social hierarchies, spiritual authority, and communal cohesion. The sacrifice was not merely a private act of devotion, it was a public affirmation of cultural values, societal norms, and the Inca cosmological order. By witnessing the ritual, the living participated in a collective negotiation with the divine, using fear, reverence, and awe to maintain societal equilibrium. The emotional resonance of the mountaintop sacrifice was profound. Parents and villagers experienced a complex mixture of grief, pride, and hope. The death of a child, while terrifying, was simultaneously a fulfillment of cosmic duty. The chosen, though victims in a literal sense, became living symbols of faith and human devotion, embodying ideals of purity, obedience, and spiritual transcendence. The interplay between love and loss, terror and reverence, created a psychological tension that resonated across generations. To participate in, witness, or perform these rituals was to navigate a moral landscape that intertwined devotion and horror, beauty and cruelty, life and death. Finally, the sacrifice was not a momentary act. It was the culmination of a process that transformed the chosen into eternal participants in the spiritual life of the Inca cosmos. The bodies, preserved by cold, altitude, and ritual care, were intended to remain as silent intermediaries between humans and gods. They were guardians of fertility, protectors against natural disasters, and embodiments of divine favor. Archaeological discoveries of these frozen mummies, their ceremonial adornments intact, create an unsettling connection across time, allowing modern observers to witness the terrifying precision and spiritual intensity of the Inca sacrificial tradition. In the end, the mountaintop sacrifices of the Inca reveal a civilization that fused awe-inspiring devotion with unimaginable human suffering. The climactic ritual, where children, adolescents, and sometimes young adults met their fate with ceremonial reverence, was a profound statement of faith, cosmology, and societal order. The frozen mummies, gold ornaments, coca leaves, and meticulously arranged altars are not merely relics. They are evidence of a world in which human life was inseparable from the sacred, where beauty and horror existed side by side, and where devotion demanded the ultimate offering. At the summit, on the edge of the world, the Inca transformed terror into transcendence, fear into ritual, and death into an enduring testament of faith. After the final breath was drawn, and the wind whispered across the mountaintop shrines, the Inca believed that the journey of the chosen had only just begun. Death was not a cessation but a transformation, a passage from the human world into the divine realm. The frozen bodies, carefully arranged atop the stone altars, were meant to serve as eternal intermediaries between the earthly and spiritual planes. They became guardians of the mountains, protectors of crops, and witnesses to the delicate balance between humanity and the gods. To the Inca, the act of sacrifice was a bridge, a sacred transaction in which mortal life was exchanged for cosmic favor. The mountains themselves, silent and majestic, bore witness to this sacred transition, their peaks both cradle and cathedral for the departed. The Inca envisioned the afterlife of these sacrificial victims as a continuation of purpose. The children were believed to ascend spiritually to join the deities, watching over the living and maintaining harmony in the natural and supernatural worlds. Unlike modern interpretations of death as loss, the Inca framed it as honor and transcendence. The frozen mummies atop Yuyayacá, Salcantay, and other summits were not seen as corpses but as eternally active participants in divine processes. Their sacrifice was meant to prevent natural disasters, ensure fertile harvests, and maintain the favor of the gods. In this way, the victims' deaths were deeply intertwined with the survival and prosperity of entire communities, turning individual tragedy into a sacred collective benefit. The physical preservation of the bodies was itself part of the spiritual narrative. The freezing temperatures, thin air, and low humidity of the high Andes acted as a natural embalming process, allowing these children to remain frozen in time, untouched by decay. Their hair, clothing, and even delicate ceremonial adornments were preserved for centuries, a testament to the ritual's precision and the unforgiving yet protective embrace of the mountains. Each frozen body became a symbol of cosmic continuity, a tangible reminder that life and death, fear and devotion, beauty and horror, were inseparably intertwined. Archaeologists describe a sense of reverence when handling these remains, as if the mummies themselves still contain the essence of the spiritual energy that had carried them through the final ascent. The psychological framework surrounding this afterlife was intricate. Communities understood that the mountains demanded strict adherence to ritual, and the sacrificed children were seen as both a fulfillment of duty and a moral compass for the living. Their continued presence, preserved in ice and adorned with ceremonial objects, reminded society of the consequences of neglecting the gods or upsetting the balance of nature. In essence, the frozen bodies were not passive relics. They were active participants in a sacred dialogue between humans and the divine, a dialogue that maintained moral, social, and spiritual order. Fear, awe, and reverence intertwined in the minds of those who observed and remembered these rituals, reinforcing the cyclical nature of life, death, and cosmic duty. The mountains themselves amplified the sacredness of this transition. From the summit, the horizon stretched endlessly, blending sky and earth in a panorama of sublime isolation. The wind carried the echoes of ritual chants, a soundscape that merged with the howling peaks to create an otherworldly atmosphere. In this setting, death was not merely an end but a visible, almost tangible form of spiritual transformation. The very environment reinforced the Inca belief that the departed were elevated, both literally and metaphorically, to a higher plane where they could intercede for the living. Every icy gust, every drifting cloud, and every creaking ridge became part of the ritual narrative, shaping both the experience of those present and the afterlife of the sacrificed. Communities internalized this vision of posthumous purpose. By understanding that the sacrificed children were watching, guiding, and protecting them, the Inca reinforced societal cohesion and obedience. Ritualized fear of the gods merged with love for the departed, creating a powerful psychological mechanism that ensured adherence to cultural norms. Parents who had offered their children could reconcile grief with pride, understanding that their child's death was not senseless but sacred. Villagers who had participated or observed could draw comfort and meaning from the belief that the victims were actively maintaining the favor of the deities, protecting the lands, and guarding against misfortune. The interplay of fear, devotion, and moral reflection formed a tapestry that bound the society together, threading spiritual purpose through the very fabric of daily life. Modern forensic studies of these mummies illuminate both the physical and psychological dimensions of the afterlife as imagined by the Inca. Hair analysis, clothing preservation, and the careful placement of offerings provide insight into the meticulous preparation that extended even beyond death. These rituals were not improvised acts of violence. They were highly organized, spiritual performances in which every detail, from the direction of the body to the arrangement of ceremonial objects, had significance. Through these frozen witnesses, researchers glimpsed the extraordinary care, devotion, and fear that shaped the sacrificial system. The Inca transformed death into both a spiritual instrument and a societal statement, blending the physical, emotional, and divine into a singular, enduring act of faith. The aesthetic and symbolic elements of the shrines further reinforced the notion of an active afterlife. Textiles, figurines, and painted objects were carefully arranged to accompany the victims, ensuring that they retained agency even in death. Gold and silver, symbols of divine light and purity, were placed alongside the bodies, while coca leaves and maize represented nourishment for the spiritual journey. This attention to detail reflects a worldview in which beauty, order, and reverence were inseparable from acts of sacrifice. In essence, the mummies were not passive remnants of death. They were living participants in the spiritual ecosystem, actively bridging human existence and divine will. Ultimately, the afterlife of the sacrificial victims represents the profound moral and psychological complexity of Inca culture. The mountains, frozen mummies, and ceremonial objects together embody a vision in which death is elevated into a sacred instrument, a bridge between worlds, and a guarantor of communal survival. For modern observers, this narrative is simultaneously awe-inspiring and deeply unsettling, revealing a civilization that intertwined devotion, terror, and cosmic order in ways almost unimaginable today. The silence of the peaks, the stillness of the frozen bodies, and the meticulous arrangement of ritual offerings all serve as enduring testimony to a belief system that viewed death not as loss, but as transcendence and eternal purpose. By contemplating the afterlife of these sacrifices, we gain insight into the extraordinary lengths to which the Inca went to maintain cosmic balance. Their rituals were not merely acts of brutality, they were moral, social, and spiritual frameworks designed to align human life with the whims of powerful deities. Through these mountaintop shrines and the preserved remains of the chosen, the Inca demonstrated a capacity to fuse horror and beauty, fear and reverence, human suffering and divine aspiration, into a single, cohesive vision of existence. The frozen children, guardians of the mountains and witnesses to human devotion, remind us that in the Inca worldview, death was not the end, but a beginning, a perpetual act of cosmic negotiation, eternal in both purpose and power. Modern archaeology has peeled back the layers of centuries, revealing secrets long hidden in the frozen heights of the Andes. For decades, the mountaintop shrines of the Inca were little more than myth, whispered about in local legend or chronicled in fragments by early Spanish explorers. Yet through careful excavation and forensic analysis, researchers have uncovered astonishing evidence, perfectly preserved mummies, ceremonial artifacts, and intricate offerings that tell a story of faith, fear, and ritualized terror. Sites like Yuyayaca, Ambato, and Salcantay have become portals into a world where human sacrifice was a meticulously planned expression of devotion, offering contemporary observers a glimpse into the minds, bodies, and beliefs of a vanished civilization. The discovery of the Yuyayaca, Ice Maiden, in 1999 shocked the world. She was an adolescent girl, her body frozen and preserved at nearly 22,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by miniature figurines, textiles, and ceremonial food offerings. Her face, remarkably intact, displays an eerie serenity, a haunting testament to the cultural notion of death as honor rather than tragedy. Scientists could see the careful preparation, her hair braided with intricate patterns, her clothing dyed with vibrant pigments, and her body positioned in a manner consistent with ritual protocol. The preservation allowed for unprecedented study of her life and death. Isotopic analysis of her hair and teeth revealed her diet, exposure to substances like coca leaves, and even the possibility of ritual intoxication or sedation prior to sacrifice. Each detail brought the ritual vividly to life, offering insight into the Inca worldview that had been frozen along with her body for over 500 years. Similar discoveries across other mountaintop sites have reinforced this vision. At Ambato, the mummy known as Juanita revealed comparable preparation and ceremonial care. The body, frozen in the midst of a snowy altar, was accompanied by intricate offerings and gold ornaments. Forensic examination suggested that she had likely been sedated with coca, beer, or other hallucinogenic substances to facilitate compliance and reduce fear. Archaeologists interpret these findings as evidence of an organized, deeply ritualized practice, carefully orchestrated to satisfy the demands of the gods while maintaining the integrity of the sacrificial act. These sites show that the Inca were not improvising. They were executing a complex religious system that merged precision, psychological manipulation, and ceremonial reverence into one cohesive, terrifying ritual. Modern science has also shed light on the physical and emotional experiences of the victims. Analysis of the Yuyayaca children and other mountaintop mummies indicates that they endured extreme conditions prior to death, including long ascents at high altitudes, cold exposure, and restricted diets designed to prepare them physically and spiritually. Traces of ceremonial drugs and hair samples suggest a deliberate effort to alter consciousness, creating a liminal state in which fear, devotion, and hallucination blurred together. These findings illuminate the psychological depth of the Inca ritual. The ascent and sacrifice were not merely acts of physical endurance but intricate performances that shaped the mind, preparing the victims to fulfill their role in the spiritual cosmos. In essence, the mountains themselves, the priests, and the substances used combined to create a psychological crucible as formidable as the physical climb. The arrangement of offerings and ceremonial artifacts also speaks volumes about Inca cosmology. Miniature pottery, figurines of llamas and humans, maize, and coca leaves were all carefully positioned, intended to accompany the victims into the afterlife. Gold and silver ornaments, symbols of divinity and purity, enhanced the sanctity of the ritual. Every element was deliberate, reflecting a culture in which aesthetic precision, spiritual devotion, and ritual efficacy were inseparable. Archaeologists note that the placement of these items often corresponds with celestial alignments, suggesting that the rituals were designed not only to honor the mountains but also to maintain harmony with the cosmos itself. In this way, the sacrifices were a tangible intersection of art, science, and spirituality, a testament to the sophistication and terrifying dedication of Inca culture. One of the most haunting aspects of these discoveries is the preserved emotional state of the victims. The frozen expressions, body positions, and hair and clothing arrangements offer subtle clues to their experiences in the final moments. Some show evidence of calm or trance, while others indicate exhaustion or tension, hinting at the psychological and physical complexity of the ritual. For researchers, these remnants are more than scientific data. They are human stories, frozen in time, that bridge the gap between contemporary observers and a civilization that understood life, death, and devotion in ways profoundly different from our own. The visceral impact of seeing these preserved bodies, knowing the circumstances of their deaths, forces a confrontation with the extremes of human faith, fear, and sacrifice. Modern revelations also challenge our understanding of Inca society and its values. The sacrifices were not arbitrary acts of violence. They were deeply embedded in political, social, and spiritual structures. By offering their most perfect children to the gods, elite families reinforced their status and demonstrated loyalty to the state and priesthood. The rituals maintained societal cohesion, upheld religious orthodoxy, and ensured the perceived favor of the deities. In effect, the sacrifices functioned as both spiritual and social instruments, binding communities together while negotiating the precarious relationship between humans and the powerful forces of nature. Archaeological evidence, combined with ethno-historical accounts, paints a picture of a civilization in which devotion, terror, and social order were tightly interwoven. The discoveries have also sparked ethical debates among archaeologists, historians, and indigenous communities. Handling, displaying, or studying these human remains raises questions about respect, consent, and the balance between scientific knowledge and reverence for the dead. Many researchers approach the sites with extreme caution, recognizing that the frozen mummies are not merely artifacts but sacred individuals whose presence continues to resonate spiritually for descendants and local communities. These modern considerations mirror the tension inherent in the original rituals themselves, acts of devotion that straddle the line between reverence and horror, obedience and suffering, preservation and transformation. Through these modern revelations, the mountaintop sacrifices of the Inca have gained renewed clarity and resonance. The frozen mummies, ceremonial artifacts, and meticulous preparations allow us to witness, in extraordinary detail, the intensity of belief and the extremes of human commitment. We see not only the horror of death but the beauty of ritual, the logic of devotion, and the profound intertwining of psychology, faith, and social order. The mountains, once silent witnesses, now speak through archaeological discovery, telling stories of courage, fear, and transcendence that have survived centuries of ice and isolation. Ultimately, the modern exploration of these shrines bridges past and present. It reveals a civilization capable of extraordinary engineering, artistry, and spiritual insight, yet willing to sacrifice its most innocent in the service of divine imperatives. It forces contemporary observers to confront uncomfortable truths about human belief, the extremes of devotion, and the moral complexity of cultures vastly different from our own. The preserved victims, their ceremonial garments, and the altars they occupied are more than historical curiosities. They are windows into a human psyche that revered life, death, and cosmic order in ways simultaneously awe-inspiring and profoundly disturbing. The frozen summits continue to echo with their presence, reminding us that in the high Andes, the boundaries between terror and transcendence, cruelty and devotion, life and death, were carefully, deliberately, and terrifyingly blurred. To understand the mountaintop sacrifices of the Inca is to confront the darkest edges of human psychology. These rituals, executed with meticulous care, were not mere displays of power or cruelty. They were acts of faith that fused terror, devotion, and social order into a single, chilling expression of belief. The psychological framework that made these sacrifices possible was complex. Fear, reverence, honor, and cosmic duty all intertwined, compelling individuals and communities to participate in, witness, and even normalize acts that, to modern eyes, seem almost unimaginable. At the heart of this system was a paradox. The most horrifying of deaths was framed as the highest honor, and the innocent became both victims and sacred intermediaries between the human and divine. For the victims themselves, the psychological dimensions were profound. Children and adolescents were selected for their purity and beauty, but also for their symbolic significance. From the moment of selection, they were thrust into a world where life and death, terror and reverence, were inseparably linked. The meticulous preparation, ceremonial clothing, ritual adornments, symbolic offerings, served to elevate the individual into a sacred instrument, simultaneously isolating them from ordinary human experience. The journey to the summit, fraught with physical and emotional trials, acted as a crucible, conditioning their minds to accept their fate while reinforcing the cultural narrative that death atop the mountains was a form of transcendence. Psychological studies of extreme ritualized environments suggest that isolation, fear, and ceremony can produce altered states of consciousness, an effect mirrored in the evidence of coca leaves and ceremonial substances found in hair samples from the frozen mummies. In essence, the Inca were orchestrating not just physical sacrifice, but a mental and spiritual transformation, preparing the victims to embrace death as divine fulfillment. The communities participating in or observing these rituals also experienced profound psychological effects. Fear of divine retribution, awe at the spectacle of the mountains, and reverence for the priests combined to create an environment where social and spiritual cohesion was reinforced. Witnessing the ascent and ultimate sacrifice of the chosen children instilled in the living a deep awareness of their place within the cosmic order. The psychological mechanism at work was both collective and individual. Terror and reverence ensured obedience to cultural norms, moral codes, and religious expectations, while the aesthetic and ceremonial elements created a sense of sublimity and spiritual elevation. By integrating fear and devotion into a single experience, the Inca maintained societal control and moral order in a way that was both terrifying and elegant. The paradox of honor in the face of horror was central to the psychological logic of the ritual. Parents offered their children, aware of the lethal consequences, because in their worldview, death at the summit was the ultimate expression of devotion and the highest form of honor. The victim's suffering was reframed as a sacred service, transforming grief into moral and spiritual affirmation. Fear and love coexisted, intertwining with faith to create a complex moral landscape in which the ultimate sacrifice reinforced both familial pride and communal stability. The cognitive dissonance required to accept such practices underscores the profound power of cultural and religious belief to reshape human perception of morality, value, and the sanctity of life. Even the priests, orchestrators of the ritual, operated within a psychological framework that fused authority with spiritual responsibility. Their role was both technical and moral, to ensure the sacrifice adhered to the precise ceremonial protocols, to maintain the composure and preparation of the victims, and to negotiate the balance between human life and divine expectation. The psychological burden on these religious specialists was immense. They mediated between realms of human emotion, natural danger, and cosmic authority. Mistakes or lapses could imperil the perceived favor of the gods, threatening famine, disaster, or societal upheaval. In this sense, the priests themselves were both empowered and haunted, their authority inseparable from the terrifying responsibility of guiding human beings to death in the service of faith. The frozen summits themselves became psychological actors in this ritual. The mountains were not mere backdrops. They were living, indifferent witnesses to every step, every breath, every tear. Their scale and isolation amplified fear, awe, and devotion simultaneously, transforming the physical environment into a psychological crucible. To ascend the peaks was to confront the sublime, where beauty and terror collided, and where the human mind was forced to reconcile the inevitability of death with the promise of eternal spiritual purpose. The extreme altitude, blinding snow, and vertiginous drops contributed not only to physical exhaustion but to a heightened awareness of mortality, reinforcing the sacred narrative that life and death were inseparable within the cosmic order. The moral tension embedded in these rituals is also psychologically significant. Communities were asked to witness, support, and participate in acts that involved the deliberate ending of innocent human life. Yet within the Inca framework, this act was morally justified, sacred, and socially reinforcing. By redefining suffering as devotion, innocence as divine medium, and death as transcendence, the Inca created a cognitive landscape in which terror became a conduit for awe, grief was transformed into pride, and horror was reframed as moral necessity. Modern observers are confronted with a dual reaction: admiration for the cultural sophistication and logistical precision, alongside horror at the human cost. This duality underscores the power of ritual to reshape human perception of morality and to integrate extreme acts into a coherent moral universe. In essence, the psychology of the mountaintop sacrifices reveals a civilization capable of extraordinary moral and cognitive engineering. The selection, preparation, ascent, and sacrifice of the chosen were all designed to manipulate perception, both of the victims and the communities involved, while maintaining societal cohesion, spiritual order, and cosmic favor. Fear, awe, grief, and devotion were inseparably intertwined, producing a system in which acts that would otherwise seem monstrous were rendered sacred, moral, and necessary. The rituals leveraged the human capacity for empathy, reverence, and obedience, transforming horror into a tool of faith and social continuity. The frozen mummies left behind are the ultimate testament to this psychological sophistication. Each body, perfectly preserved, adorned with ceremonial garments, and surrounded by offerings, communicates a narrative of terror and transcendence that transcends centuries. Modern researchers, confronting the physical evidence, are forced to grapple not only with historical facts but with the enduring psychological power of the rituals themselves. The combination of beauty, fear, and devotion creates a haunting resonance, illustrating how human belief can both inspire and terrify, elevate and destroy. Ultimately, the psychology of Inca sacrifice challenges contemporary understanding of morality, devotion, and the human capacity for both horror and reverence. It is a world in which innocence could be transformed into sacred agency, terror reframed as honor, and death reimagined as the ultimate form of devotion. By studying these rituals, we confront the extraordinary lengths to which human beings can go in the service of belief and the profound cognitive mechanisms that allow societies to integrate horror, awe, and moral purpose into a coherent cultural framework. The frozen summits of the Andes remain silent witnesses to this reality, their stillness echoing with centuries of devotion, fear, and psychological mastery. The Andes' frozen peaks stand as silent witnesses to rituals that once defined the Inca world, their mountaintop shrines preserving a haunting blend of beauty, devotion, and terror. Centuries have passed, yet the frozen children, adorned with gold, textiles, and ceremonial offerings, continue to speak across time. Their deaths, far from senseless, were the ultimate act of devotion, a terrifying paradox in which innocence became sacred agency. Modern archaeology allows us to glimpse the precision and care with which these sacrifices were conducted, the careful positioning of bodies, the symbolic items surrounding them, and the strategic use of coca and chicha to ease the final journey. Every detail reflects a society capable of transforming horror into a moral and spiritual instrument. Beyond the individual victims, these rituals shaped communities, reinforcing social hierarchies, religious authority, and cosmic order. Families, priests, and villages participated in or witnessed the sacrifices, internalizing moral lessons about obedience, reverence, and human responsibility to the gods. Fear and awe were inseparable, binding society together while ensuring that the favor of the deities remained aligned with human action. The mountains themselves amplified this psychological and spiritual effect, their majesty and isolation turning the ascent and sacrifice into a journey of both physical endurance and moral reckoning. The preserved mummies serve as more than historical records. They are moral and psychological touchstones. They remind us that human belief can sanctify suffering, that terror can coexist with honor, and that the human mind can reconcile horror with purpose when guided by faith and culture. For modern observers, these frozen witnesses provoke awe, horror, and reflection, challenging contemporary understandings of morality and devotion. Ultimately, the legacy of the mountaintop sacrifices endures in its ability to confront us with the extremes of human faith. The frozen children of the Andes embody courage, devotion, and the profound tension between life, death, and cosmic order. They are reminders that history preserves not only events but the complex moral and psychological landscapes that shape them, leaving a haunting, unforgettable testament to the extraordinary capabilities and terrifying extremes of human belief.